The laughter started before the walls were finished. The village of Thornwick in the West Riding of Yorkshire had been doing things the same way since the time of the Conqueror, and the particular way it stored firewood was part of those things, which was to say it did not store firewood in any particular way at all. You cut it when you could cut it. You piled it against the cottage wall or the barn wall when you had a wall to pile it against. And in November, when the first real cold arrived, you found that the wood on the bottom of the pile had been sitting on wet ground since August and had gone soft and dark with rot. And the wood in the middle of the pile had absorbed 6 weeks of Yorkshire rain and was the color of old iron, and the wood on top was the only wood that burned. The way wood was supposed to burn, which was hot and clean and without the hissing complaint of wet timber arguing with a fire. Every man and woman in Thornwick knew this, and every man and woman in Thornwick had accepted it as the condition of winter, the same way they had accepted mud and darkness and the grinding weight of the harvest tithe that the steward of Ravensworth Manor came to collect each September with the precision of a man who had never in his life accepted anything less than was owed. Edmund Hale was 22 years old in the autumn of 1248, and he had been watching the wood problem since he was a child watching his father, and he had been thinking about the wood problem since he was old enough to think about why things were the way they were, rather than simply accepting that they were. And in September of 1248 he began to build the shed that the village of Thornwick laughed at. He was the youngest free tenant in the village, which was his father's legacy and the thing that separated him from the villains who worked the Lord's domain and owed 3 days' labor per week and had no time to spend thinking about firewood sheds or anything else that was not the Lord's work or the minimum necessary to keep themselves alive. Edmund Hale owned a virgate of land outright, 15 acres of the open field system that his grandfather had held by charter and that no steward could revoke, which was a thing of quiet consequence in a world where most of your neighbors held their land at the pleasure of a man who lived 4 miles north in a stone hall. He had spent the summer of 1248 watching his father's wood pile in a way he had not watched it before, and what he had watched was water. He had watched it rain in June. He had watched the ground at the base of the wood pile absorb the rain and hold it, the clay soil of the West, holding water the way clay held everything, tightly, and for a long time. He had watched the bottom course of birch rounds go dark with moisture absorbed from the ground below them. He had pressed his hand to the dark rounds and felt the cold wet of wood that had given up being wood and was becoming something slower and darker. He had watched it rain in July. He had watched the rounds in the middle of the pile turn from the pale tan of recently cut birch to the gray tan of birch that had been rained on repeatedly and not dried between rains. He had watched his sister carry wood to the fire on a July evening and watched the fire struggle with the wood the way a fire struggled with wood it did not want, making smoke first and heat later and never quite the heat that the same wood would have made in August after a dry fortnight. He had watched it rain in August. He had pressed his hand to the pile in August and felt the whole mass of it, not just the bottom courses, but the middle courses and even the upper courses on the north face of the pile, the face that the Yorkshire rain fell against longest, because the rain came from the north and the northwest and always had. He had thought about what he was feeling. He was not a builder's son. He was a farmer's son, and his knowledge of construction was the knowledge of a free tenant who had helped raise a barn frame twice and had watched the village carpenter work on the church roof repair the previous spring, which was more than most men his age had observed of how structures worked against weather. But he had looked at the problem with the particular patience of a young man who had decided that the way things were was not necessarily the only way they could be. He thought about what the woodpile needed. It needed 3 things. It needed to be off the ground, because the ground was where the moisture came from below. It needed to be protected from the rain that came from above and from the north and northwest. And it needed some way for the air to move through it, because air movement was what dried things, which he knew from hanging his father's linen on a dry windy day and watching it dry in 2 hours rather than the 6 it took on a still day. He thought about these 3 things for several weeks, and then he went to look at the hillside. The hillside was the south-facing slope at the east edge of the Thornwick Common, a low ridge that ran north to south at the boundary of the common pasture and the home closes. The slope faced south and slightly east, which was where the winter sun came from in Yorkshire at its low winter angle. What little winter sun there was. The hillside was dry. It was always dry on the surface, even after rain, because the south face of a slope shed water instead of collecting it, and because the clay that held water everywhere else in the West Riding met, on this hillside, a seam of limestone that ran close to the surface and drained the rainwater away before it could accumulate. He pressed his hand to the hillside soil in late August and held it there. The surface was warm from the summer sun. He pushed in 3 inches. Cooler. He pushed in 6 inches. Cooler still, the temperature of deep earth that the summer's warmth had not yet reached, the temperature of a place that kept its temperature regardless of what the sky was doing. He stood up and looked at the slope and thought about what he was going to build. What he was going to build was this: a shed set into the south face of the hillside, its back wall and side walls backed by the earthen bank of the slope itself, its front face open to the south and slightly east, facing the direction the winter sun came from. The floor of the shed would be raised on flat stones, 2 courses of limestone from the hillside seam, so that the wood sitting on the floor was 6 inches above the ground and no moisture could wick upward from the earth into the wood below. The roof would be steeply pitched, steeper than any roof in Thornwick, with an overhang that ran 2 feet past the front face of the shed, so that the rain falling at any angle from the north and northwest would hit the extended roof and fall to the ground 2 feet in front of the shed rather than onto the front stacked wood. The walls where he built them would be the hillside itself. He did not need to build a north wall. The hillside was his north wall, and the hillside was 15 feet of Yorkshire earth that kept its temperature through the coldest winter and was impervious to the rain and the wind and every other thing the Yorkshire sky chose to deploy against it. He did not need to build a west wall. He would cut into the hillside and let the hillside be the west wall as well. He needed to build only the roof and the front face and the raised floor. He began on a Monday in early September. The cutting into the hillside was the first work. He used the mattock from his father's tool store, the heavy-headed mattock that had been cutting Yorkshire clay since his grandfather's day, and he worked into the south face of the slope from a point approximately 6 feet from the base of the rise, cutting inward and upward at the angle the hillside provided, removing the earth and the limestone rubble and carrying it in a basket to the north side of the cutting where it made a low berm that he packed and tamped with his feet as he went. The cutting took 4 days. What he had at the end of 4 days was a space approximately 14 feet wide and 9 feet deep cut into the hillside, with the natural earth forming the back wall and the left wall and the ceiling, and with the right wall still needing to be cut back another 2 feet to give him the width he needed on that side. On the 5th day he cut the right side back. On the 6th day he laid the floor. The limestone seam that ran through the hillside provided flat stones naturally, the limestone splitting along its horizontal bedding planes in the way that sedimentary rock split when you knew where to apply the mattock. He selected the flattest pieces, the pieces that lay level without rocking, and he laid them first in the 2 courses of stone that would be the floor supports, the stone legs that would hold the wood off the ground. He laid these support courses in 2 parallel rows running front to back along the width of the shed, 1 row a foot from the left wall and 1 row a foot from the right wall, each row 18 inches high, so that whatever he laid across them would be 18 inches above the ground. Across the support courses he laid poles, straight-grained ash poles from the hazel coppice that he had cut in August and set aside for this purpose, poles 3 inches in diameter and 14 feet long, 1 pole every 6 inches across the full 9-foot depth of the shed. 14 poles, each resting on the 2 stone support courses, each parallel to the others, each separated from its neighbors by 6 inches of open air. The open air between the poles was the most important part. He had thought about this the longest. The wood that sat on these poles would be sitting on a slatted platform that allowed air to circulate below it, upward through the gaps between the poles, moving through the stacked wood from below. The moisture that the wood shed as it dried would have somewhere to go. It would move upward through the stacked wood and out through the gaps in the front face of the shed, carried by the air movement that the south opening provided. He built the roof last. The roof was the most complex piece of the construction and the one he had thought about most carefully. He had decided on a pitch of 35 degrees, which was steeper than any roof in Thornwick, steeper than the barn roof, and steeper than the church roof, and considerably steeper than any cottage roof in the village. He had decided on this pitch because he had watched the rain fall at its Yorkshire angle, which was not the angle of places where rain fell from directly above. Yorkshire rain came at an angle from the northwest, and when it hit a shallow-pitched roof it ran back into the stacked wood at the front of the shed where the overhang ended. When it hit a steep-pitched roof it ran down quickly, gaining speed, and shot clear off the end of the overhang in a clean arc and landed in the ground 2 feet or more in front of the shed. He cut the rafters from ash poles, 10 of them, each angled from the front plate to the ridge pole at his chosen pitch. He laid oak laths across the rafters, and over the laths he laid a double course of riven oak shingles, each shingle overlapping the one below by 2/3, each course driven tight to the one above. The shingles were riven, not sawn, which meant they had been split along the grain of the oak with a froe and mallet, the same method that produced shingles in every part of England where oak grew. Riven shingles shed water along their grain lines. Sawn shingles did not, because the saw cut across the grain and left the end grain exposed. He knew this because he had watched the church roof being repaired in the spring, and he had asked the carpenter why he was taking the trouble to reeve the shingles when sawing was faster, and the carpenter had shown him by pressing his thumb against a sawn end and a riven end and letting the moisture from his skin demonstrate the difference. The sawn end absorbed it. The riven end let it run off. He extended the roof 2 feet past the front face of the shed at the eave, giving the overhang he needed. He cut 2 small drainage channels in the ground below the overhang, 6 inches deep, lined with flat limestone pieces, running the width of the shed and angling east to carry the roof water away from the shed base. He finished the shed on a Tuesday in the second week of October. He stood in front of it and looked at what he had built. It did not look like anything else in Thornwick. It looked like a shed that had been pushed into the hillside or grown from it, the earthen bank rising above the roof line, and the side walls invisible because they were the hillside. The front face was open, a simple timber frame with no door, nothing to block the south wind that would carry the moisture out of the stacked wood. The roof stood up at its steep angle with the 2-foot overhang running the full width. The floor poles were visible through the front opening, their pale ash wood contrasting with the dark earth of the hillside behind them. He began carrying his wood inside. He stacked it on the poles in the way he had been planning since August, in a method he had never seen used, but that made sense to him from the physics of drying wood. He stood each round on its end, rather than laying it on its side. A round stood on its end presented the end grain to the air, and end grain was where wood dried fastest because the water in wood moved along the grain rather than across it, and end grain was where that moisture reached the surface and evaporated. He stacked them across the full width of the shed in rows, each round standing upright, the rows slightly separated from each other so that air could move between them as well as under them. When he had filled the shed to a depth of 6 feet, he placed a single layer of poles across the top of the standing rounds and stacked the second course, also upright, also separated. It took 3 days to fill the shed with the wood he had been cutting since August, roughly 4 cord of birch and ash. The village watched. Thornwick was a village of 32 households and approximately 140 people, and like all villages of its kind, it had the complete awareness of a small community that shared a common field, a common pasture, a common mill, and a common church, and which had consequently developed over generations the habit of knowing what everyone was doing and discussing it. The woodshed was discussed from the beginning, from the first day of hillside cutting, because cutting into the common's boundary ridge was the kind of act that required explanation, and Edmund Hale had not provided one. He had not provided one because he had not been asked. He had been observed, which in Thornwick was not the same as being asked. Being observed meant that people walked past and looked and talked among themselves, and the talking happened in places where he was not present, and what it contained was not yet available to him. He found out what it contained from his sister, who was older than him by 3 years, and who had the particular social intelligence of a woman embedded in a village community that communicated entirely through proximity and implication. She told him on the Friday of the second week of October that Walter Reedman had called the shed a waste of good cutting time, and said that any man who stood his firewood on end was a man who did not understand firewood. She told him that the reeve, whose name was Gilbert Otter, and who had held the position for 11 years, had said that the hillside cutting was uncommon close to the common boundary, and that he would be watching to see that it did not encroach. She said, "They are saying the word foolish." He said, "They are saying it now." She looked at him. He said, "Ask them again in February." Gilbert Otter came to the shed on the 3rd day after it was finished, which was the Friday of the second week of October. He came with the authority and the posture of a man who had been the administrative arm of Ravensworth Manor in Thornwick for 11 years, and who had found, over those 11 years, that posture and authority could substitute for most kinds of understanding. He stood in front of the shed and looked at it and looked at Edmund Hale standing beside it. He said, "You have cut into the hillside." Edmund said, "I have cut into the slope at the east edge of the common, below the ridge, and not into the ridge." Gilbert said, "The east edge of the common is the Lord's land." Edmund said, "The common is the villagers grazing. The slope at its east edge has not been grazed in 11 years to my knowledge, and to my father's knowledge before mine." Gilbert said, "The slope at the east edge of the common is the Lord's land and the Lord's wood, and anything you have taken from it is the Lord's wood that you have taken." Edmund said, "I have taken nothing from the slope except earth and limestone rubble." He met Gilbert's eyes. "The earth and the limestone are back on the slope in the berm to the north of the cutting, which has improved the drainage of the field above the common." This was true and could be observed, and Gilbert Otter could see that it was true and could be observed. He looked at the berm. He looked at the shed. He looked at the drainage channels running east from the overhang. He said, "The roofing." Edmund said, "The shingles are from the ash coppice on my own holding. The poles are from the hazel coppice on my own holding." Gilbert said, "The floor." Edmund said, "The limestone is from the seam in the hillside." Gilbert said, "The hillside is the Lord's land." Edmund said, "The limestone from the seam has been lying in the slope since before the conquest, and it did not belong to the Lord at the conquest, and I do not believe the charter covers loose stone from a hillside seam. But I am content for the matter to go to the manor court if the reeve wishes to bring it." Gilbert Otter looked at the shed for a long time. He was a man who had navigated 11 years of small disputes between tenants in the manor's interest, and he had a particular feeling for the disputes that were worth pursuing and the disputes that were not, and the feeling he was having about this one was that a young free tenant who had already cited the charter once and mentioned the manor court once was a young free tenant who knew the machinery of dispute and would be willing to use it. He said, "I will be watching the boundary." Edmund said, "You are welcome to watch it." Gilbert went away. Edmund went back to stacking wood. October became November. The Yorkshire autumn of 1248 was wet in the way that Yorkshire autumns were regularly wet, which was thoroughly and without apology. The rain came from the northwest as it always came, at the angle and in the quantity that the West Riding produced, and it fell on the village of Thornwick with the comprehensive patience of weather that did not concern itself with the consequences for the people beneath it. By the first week of November, every woodpile in Thornwick that was not under cover had been rained on for 6 weeks. The bottom courses were dark with ground moisture that had wicked upward through direct contact with the wet clay. The middle courses were darker still, having been rained on directly from above and never fully dried between the rains. The top courses had some surface dampness on the north face where the driving rain had hit them, though the south faces of the top course were relatively dry. This was the standard condition. The village burned wood in this condition every winter and had always burned it in this condition and had organized its fuel requirements around this condition, which was to say it cut more than it needed and accepted that a third of what it cut would burn badly or not at all. Edmund Hale's wood was not in this condition. He went into the shed on the morning of the 1st of November with a piece of good fire steel and a handful of tinder and a single piece of the ash from the front left corner of the shed, the driest position, the piece that had been sitting on the pole floor with the south wind moving through it since October 12th. He struck fire with the steel and held the tinder to the chip he had split from the end of the ash round. The chip caught on the second strike. He touched the tinder to the end grain of the round itself. The round burned. Not the hissing, steaming, reluctant burning of a round that had been sitting in the rain since August. It burned with the steady, honest burning of wood that was what wood was supposed to be, dry and willing, giving its heat directly, without first using the heat to drive off the moisture that was not supposed to be there. He held his hand above the flame and felt the heat coming up cleanly, without the steam that wet wood produced. He let it burn for a count of 20 and then extinguished it by pulling it away from the tinder. He went out of the shed and pressed his hand to the south face of his father's main wood pile. The pile that was stacked in the conventional way against the east wall of the cottage, in the open air. The round he pulled from the middle of the pile was cold and dark, and when he split it with a sharp blow of the hatchet, the heartwood was pale enough, but the sapwood was dark with absorbed moisture, and the smell was the smell of wood that had been compromised. He held his fire steel to a chip of it and got nothing on 4 strikes and something like ignition on the 5th, which died when he blew on it, which was the thing wet wood did. He put the round back in the pile. He went to find his sister. She was in the cottage, and he said, "Come and look at the shed." She came to the shed, and he showed her the two rounds, the one from the shed and the one from the pile, and he showed her what happened when he struck fire to each. He showed her the color of the wood in cross-section, and he showed her the smell of each, holding each to her nose. She pressed her hand to the round from the shed. She said, "It is warm." He said, "The sun has been on it through the front opening since October." She said, "The sun on a round of ash." He said, "All day since October 12th. She pressed her hand to the round from the pile. She said, "This is cold and wet." He said, "Yes." She looked at the shed and looked at her brother. She said, "How much better does it burn?" He said, "I do not know yet, but it lights on the second strike and the other does not light at all." "I think it will burn hotter and cleaner, which means you need less of it for the same heat," she said, "and your wood will be like this through the winter." He said, "The floor keeps it off the ground. The roof keeps the rain off. The open front with the south exposure gives it air that moves through it and carries the damp away." He paused. "And the hillside behind keeps the temperature stable. Wood that freezes solid in a cold snap cannot be split, cannot be loaded onto a handcart, cannot be fed to a fire quickly. The hillside keeps the shed above freezing even when the air outside is below." She looked at the back wall of the shed, which was the earth of the hillside. She said, "The earth." He said, "Feel it." She pressed both palms to the back wall of the shed, the packed clay and limestone of the hillside. It was cool, not cold. The same temperature that earth kept itself at, the temperature that did not change when the sky changed, the steady 50 degrees of deep Yorkshire soil. He said, "In January, when the outside air is well below freezing, the back wall of this shed will be approximately the same temperature it is now. The hillside does not freeze at depth. The cold cannot pull the temperature of the shed below the temperature of the hill." She pulled her hands from the wall and looked at him. She said, "Where did you learn this?" He said, "I learned it from watching the wood pile rot every year for as long as I can remember." She said, "And the hillside part?" He said, "I learned that from pressing my hand into the soil in August." She paused. "It was colder than the surface. In January, it will be warmer than the air." She said, "You worked this out yourself?" He said, "Most of it. Father told me once that the spring well on the east field never froze, not in the worst winters, and that was why the livestock survived when the surface troughs froze over. He said the earth kept the spring at its own temperature. He said this as a fact about the spring, not as a lesson about anything else. But I thought about it." She said, "He will want to see this." He said, "I know." His father came to the shed that evening. Edmund showed him the two rounds in the fire steel demonstration, the same demonstration he had shown his sister. His father was a man of 53 who had been burning wet Yorkshire wood his whole life, and who looked at the dry round from the shed with the attention of someone who was reassessing a thing he had assumed was fixed. He pressed the fire steel to the chip from the shed round. "Fire on the first strike." He said, "It lights like August wood." Edmund said, "It is dry like August wood." The shed kept it like August wood. His father pressed his hand to the hillside back wall. He held it there for a long time. He said, "The earth is warm." Edmund said, "The earth is not warm. It is 50 degrees, which feels warm in November." His father said, 50 degrees. Edmund said, "Approximately. It does not change. The air outside in January may be 15 degrees. The back wall of this shed will be 50 degrees. The shed will hold somewhere between those two temperatures." He paused. "Above freezing. The wood will not freeze." His father looked at the standing rounds on their pole floor. Their end grain turned upward and outward, each round separated from its neighbor by the width of his hand. He said, "Standing." Edmund said, "The end grain dries faster, and standing leaves the air to move between them." His father pressed his hand to the end grain of one of the standing rounds. He held it there. He lifted his hand and compared it to a round from the pile by the cottage wall, pressing both palms to the two surfaces simultaneously. He said, "This one is drier." Edmund said, "Yes." His father was quiet for a long time. He walked to the back of the shed and pressed both hands to the hillside wall, and then walked back to the front and stood in the south-facing opening and looked at the roof overhang above him. He said, "The overhang." Edmund said. 2 feet. The rain comes at its angle from the northwest and hits the steep face of the roof and runs down and shoots off the overhang and lands 2 feet in front of the shed. His father went outside and looked at where the ground was wet and where it was dry. The ground directly in front of the shed, beneath the overhang, was noticeably drier than the ground 6 feet away, where the rain had been falling for 6 weeks without a roof above it. He said, "The rain falls off the edge." Edmund said, "Yes. The steeper the pitch, the farther it carries." He showed his father the drainage channels below the overhang. He said, "And these carry it east, so it does not pool below the overhang and wick back under the floor." His father stood in the November afternoon and looked at the shed his son had built into the hillside while the village of Thornwick called it foolishness, and he said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Gilbert Otter came." Edmund said, "I know, I heard." His father said, "And Walter Reedman." Edmund said, "I know what Walter Reedman said." His father looked at the shed. He said, "Your grandfather cut wood in the same field and piled it against the same wall and burned it the same way for 50 years. He paused. "Every year in January, half the pile was fit for burning and half was not." He paused again. "Every year I thought, this is how wood is in January." Edmund said, "Yes." His father said, "It is not how wood has to be in January." Edmund said, "No." His father said, "It is how wood has always been in January because no one thought to change it." Edmund said, "Yes." His father was quiet for another while. Then he said, "How much more warmth do you think it gives? The dry wood against the wet?" Edmund thought about this. He said, "I have heard it said that wet wood gives half the heat of dry wood of the same weight, because half the fire's work goes to driving off the moisture rather than producing heat." He said, "I think a cord of dry wood may do the work of a cord and a half or 2 cords of wet wood." His father said, "Twice the heat from the same cord." Edmund said, "Perhaps. We will know better in March." The winter came. The Yorkshire winter of 1248 to 1249 arrived on a Saturday in late November with the particular seriousness of a season that had been building pressure since October and had finally decided to spend it. The temperature dropped below freezing on the Saturday night and held there through Sunday and Monday and into the week. The ground froze. The stock ponds froze over. The water in the surface troughs froze overnight and needed breaking each morning before the animals could drink. The woodpiles froze. This was the thing that happened every winter, and that everyone in Thornwick accepted as the thing that happened. The way they accepted the mud and the dark and the weight of the tithe. The wet wood froze into a mass, each round cemented to its neighbors by the ice that formed in the absorbed moisture. And the frozen mass was as hard and uncooperative as limestone, resistant to the axe and the hatchet, requiring a full morning of effort before it yielded enough fuel for a single day's fire. Edmund Hale went to the shed on the morning of the 3rd day of the freeze. The temperature outside was 18 degrees. He pressed his hand to the hillside back wall. It was not as warm as it had been in October, because 6 weeks of cold air had been moving through the open front of the shed and had pulled some warmth from the airspace. But the wall was not frozen. It was 37 or 38 degrees, he judged, which was cold but was above freezing. The air in the shed was cold. He could see his breath. But the floor temperature, judged by pressing his palm to the limestone pole supports, was close to the wall temperature. The earth under the shed floor had its temperature, and the earth's temperature was not going to yield to 6 weeks of Yorkshire winter. He pulled around from the second course, the inside stack, the wood that had been in the shed for 6 weeks with no rain reaching it and the hillside temperature beneath it. He held it up and turned it in his hands. It was not frozen. He could feel the end grain with his fingers, and the end grain was dry and fibrous, the wood of wood that had never been rained on since it was cut. He split a chip from it with his clasp knife. The chip was pale inside, not the darker stain of absorbed moisture. He carried the round to the cottage and built the morning fire. The fire built in 6 minutes from the first spark to a steady burn. No hissing, no steam, the birch wood of the round giving its heat directly, cleanly, without the wet wood's complaint. He put 2 rounds on the fire, and the fire gave, from those 2 rounds, the heat that his mother said afterward was the heat of 3 of the pile rounds. She said this after she had been in the cottage for 2 hours, watching the fire, and watching the heat, and feeling how the cottage was warming, which was faster and more thoroughly than it warmed from the pile wood. and she said, "It is giving more." He said, "It is giving all that it has. The pile wood gives half of what it has because the other half goes to the water." His mother looked at the fire. She said, "And we are burning half what we usually burn." He said, "Close to half, perhaps a little more. We will see by March." The news from the shed went through the village the way news went through Thornwick, which was completely and within 2 days. The news was not that Edmund Hale's shed kept the wood dry, because the shed had been there since October, and everyone had been told it would keep the wood dry and had decided whether to believe this before any evidence was available. The news was specific and concrete. The wood from the shed was lighting on the first strike and the 3rd day of the freeze, while the wood from the piles was frozen solid and required an hour of axe work to break loose. Walter Reedman's son Thomas was 14 years old and worked beside his father at the frozen pile on the 3rd morning of the freeze, and he came to Edmund Hale's shed at midday and stood in the opening and looked at the rounds standing on their poles and reached in and pulled one from the front course and turned it in his hands. He said, "It is not frozen." Edmund said, "The hillside keeps the shed above freezing." Thomas said, "How?" Edmund said, "The earth 15 feet into the hillside has not frozen in this winter or any winter. It holds its temperature. The earth behind the back wall of the shed is above freezing and it puts its warmth into the air of the shed." He said, "The cold outside air comes through the front and the warm earth air holds against it. The temperature in the shed stays above freezing." Thomas said, "And the wood does not freeze." Edmund said, "And the wood does not freeze." Thomas pressed his hand to the back wall of the shed. He pulled his hand back and looked at it. He said, "My father says the shed is foolishness." Edmund said, "Your father said it in October." Thomas said, "He says it in December also." Edmund said nothing. Thomas held the round in his hands for a moment longer. He said, "How much wood do you have?" Edmund said, 4 cord cut and stacked. "I have used perhaps a 1/4 cord since October." Thomas said, 1 cord in 8 weeks. Edmund said, "We are burning close to half what we burned before. The dry wood gives twice the heat." Thomas looked at the fire. He said, "My father burned through his shed store last week and went to the pile yesterday." He paused. "It took him and me all morning to break enough loose for 2 days." Edmund said, "Yes." Thomas said, "Can you show me how this was built?" Edmund looked at him. He was 14 years old and asking a serious question in the voice of someone who had been breaking frozen wood all morning and had done the arithmetic that showed him where that road led. He said, "Yes. Come Saturday." Thomas came Saturday, and he came with his older brother Martin, who was 20, and Martin came with his particular skepticism intact, which was the skepticism of a young man who had heard his father say foolishness enough times that the word had become a reflex. But Martin pressed his hand to the back wall of the shed and pressed his hand to the dry wood and held it next to a round from the pile that he had brought specifically to compare, and the comparison was available to anyone who pressed 2 hands to 2 surfaces and felt the difference. He said nothing when he felt the 2 pieces. He watched Edmund explain the floor and the pitch and the overhang and the hillside. He listened without talking, which was how Edmund knew he was actually listening. He said at the end of the explanation, "Could this be built on our holding?" Edmund said, "Where is the south-facing hillside on your holding?" Martin said, "There is a small rise at the south end of our home close. South-facing." Edmund said, "I will come and look at it." Gilbert Otter came to the shed for the 2nd time on a Thursday in the 2nd week of December. He came alone, which was different from the October visit. In October he had come with the full weight of his position, the posture and the authority and the implication of the Lord's interest at his back. In December he came alone, and he walked to the open front of the shed and stood there for a while before Edmund noticed him and came out of the cottage. Edmund came out and they looked at each other. Gilbert said, "It is not frozen." Edmund said, "No." Gilbert pressed his hand to the nearest round in the front stack. He pressed it to the end grain, then to the side grain. He pulled a round from the middle and split a chip with his thumbnail the way a man split wood to check its quality. The inside was pale and dry. He said, "Your fire this morning." Edmund said, 6 minutes from spark to steady burn. The fire last night held through 7 hours from 3 rounds. Gilbert said, 3 rounds for 7 hours. Edmund said, "I used 4 on the coldest nights." Gilbert was quiet. He walked to the back of the shed and pressed his palm to the hillside wall and held it there. He said, "The earth is warm." Edmund said, "The earth is not warm. It is approximately the same temperature it has been since September. The air outside is well below freezing, and the earth is not." Gilbert said, "Because the earth is deep." Edmund said, "Because the earth is deep? Yes. The cold cannot reach below 15 feet in the worst of our winters. The temperature at depth does not change. The back wall of this shed is deep earth. It does not freeze." Gilbert looked up at the steep roof and the 2-foot overhang. He looked at the drainage channels below the overhang. He said, "The roof." Edmund said, "The steep pitch throws the rain clear. The shingles are riven so the water runs with the grain rather than into it." Gilbert said, "And the overhang?" Edmund said, 2 feet. The rain falls off the end of it and lands in the channel and runs east." Gilbert pressed his hand to the floor poles. He said, "The floor." Edmund said, "The poles are 18 inches above the ground. No moisture from the ground reaches the wood. The air moves under the wood and carries whatever moisture the wood releases." Gilbert was quiet for a long time. He was doing the calculation that a man who had managed the village's resources for 11 years was equipped to do, which was the calculation of wood consumed against wood available and what the gap between them meant for the people who had to navigate it. He said, "Walter Reedman has been to the pile every day this week." Edmund said, "I know." Gilbert said, "The pile is half stone by now." Edmund said, "The wet rounds freeze together and cannot be split apart without hours of work." Gilbert said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said, "Thornwick has enough wood cut for a standard winter." He paused. "The past 3 winters have been standard." He said, "What is the winter of 1248 to 1249? Edmund said, "I do not know yet." Gilbert said, "If it runs 2 weeks long." Edmund said, "Thornwick will be burning fence posts in March." Gilbert looked at him. He said, "And you?" Edmund said, "I have 4 cord cut. I am burning less than half what a pile gives because my wood is dry and gives full heat." He paused. "I will come out of March with 2 cord remaining." Gilbert said, "2 cord." Edmund said, "Close to that." Gilbert was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want to show this to the other tenants." Edmund said nothing. Gilbert said, "Not as my idea, as yours." Edmund said, "You are welcome to bring them." Gilbert said, "I will bring them Sunday, after church." He brought them Sunday. He brought 17 of Thornwick's 32 householders, the men whose households had woodcutting responsibility and who were beginning, in the 2nd week of December's freeze, to do the arithmetic that a frozen woodpile and a cold winter produced. He brought them to the shed and he stood to one side while Edmund explained the floor and the pitch and the overhang and the hillside, and he said nothing except at the end when a man named Richard Cooper said the building of such a shed would require a south-facing hillside that not every holding had. "I will look at the common boundary for sites that the Lord might make available to those who do not have suitable ground of their own." He said it as if the idea had come to him in that moment, which it had not, because a man who managed a village's resources for 11 years thought ahead of his words. Edmund said nothing about this. He had not been asked to. The building started in spring, when the ground was workable again. 5 holdings built sheds on the Hale model in the spring and summer of 1249, and 3 of them found south-facing hillsides on their own land, and 2 of them used sites on the common boundary that Gilbert Otter had identified through the winter and made available through the manor court under terms that were neither generous nor unreasonable, which was the exact character of Gilbert Otter's administration. Walter Reedman did not build. Walter Reedman had said foolishness in October and said it again in December and said it a 3rd time in the spring, and the 3rd time had the particular quality of the 3rd time, which was the quality of a statement that had been true about the person saying it and false about the thing being said for long enough that it had become part of the person's identity and could no longer be revised without revising the identity. He burned through his wood in the last week of February, which was a week later than Edmund had said he would. He spent the first 2 weeks of March cutting green wood, which burned poorly, and burning fence rails, which burned adequately, and borrowing 2 days' worth of fuel from his neighbor Richard Cooper, who had enough because Cooper had built the shed. He came to Edmund's shed in March. He came alone, which was the same as Gilbert had come alone in December, which was how people came to look at things they had been wrong about and did not want witnesses for. He stood at the open front of the shed and looked at the 2 cord remaining. He pressed his hand to a round in the front course. He said nothing. Edmund said, "You can have a cord to get through March." Walter looked at him. He said, "At what price?" Edmund said, "No price." He said it as flatly as he would have said any true thing. Walter said, "Why?" Edmund said, "Because your family is cold and you need the wood." Walter was quiet for a moment. He said, "And you can spare it." Edmund said, "Yes." Walter said, "Because the shed worked." Edmund said, "Because the shed worked." Walter took the cord. He carried it across the village in 3 trips, which took him most of the morning. He said nothing else to Edmund except, at the end of the last trip, standing with the last bundle on his shoulder in the March cold, he said, "The floor." Edmund said, "Yes." Walter said, "The floor keeps the water from below, and the poles let the air through." Edmund said, "Yes." Walter said, "And in summer when I cut for next winter." Edmund said, "You need a south-facing slope or a site that faces south within 20 degrees of east. The slope should be 8 to 10 feet high for a shed of 15 feet deep. The limestone or dense clay of the hillside behind it should be the back wall, which you do not build." He paused. "I will help you mark the site if you bring me to it." Walter Reedman looked at the ground for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." He did not say he had been wrong. Edmund did not require it. The cord of wood and the offer to help mark the site contained everything that needed to be said between 2 men who had been on opposite sides of a thing for 5 months. Walter found his south slope on his home close's north boundary, a low bank of 6 feet facing southeast. Not perfect, but workable. Edmund looked at it in April and said, "The overhang will need to be 2.5 feet because the angle is not quite south. The drainage channels on the east side and the slope will need to be cleared so the water runs away quickly." Walter built the shed in May and June. He built it himself, without help, which Edmund understood was the way Walter Reedman needed to build it. He made mistakes on the floor orientation, and Edmund showed him twice where the floor poles were laid in the wrong direction and needed to be relaid so the air moved toward the south opening rather than along the back wall. Walter relaid them without complaint. Edmund pressed his hand to the back wall of the finished Reedman shed in June. The earth was 60 degrees from the summer above. In November, it would be 50 degrees. In January, it would be 48. The shed would hold above freezing through any Yorkshire winter. He said, "It will work." Walter said, "If I have built it right." Edmund said, "You have built it right." The winter of 1249 to 1250 was the hardest winter in Yorkshire in 14 years, which was what the old men in the village said, and which meant it was the hardest winter in the memory of everyone under 40, which was most of the village. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees in the second week of December and held there for 11 days. The creek froze solid. The livestock needed the ice broken for them twice a day, or they did not drink. 2 of the common field's boundary ditches froze and needed picking open with iron bars before the field drainage resumed. The sky was clear for 8 days of the 11, which was the clear, cold sky that came when the weather had committed fully to being winter and was not going to compromise. In the standard cottage, burning pile wood through 11 days of 14-degree cold, a family burned through a cord and a quarter. In a standard cottage burning dry shed wood from a hill-backed shed, a family burned through half a cord. This was the calculation that Edmund had been working toward since August of 1248. He wrote it in the account of his holdings, which was not the formal account of a manor, but the household account of a free tenant who kept his records in the way his father had kept records, in a bound set of parchment leaves where he tracked the animals and the harvest yields and the wood consumption and the weather. He wrote, "Second week of December, 14 degrees, 11 days, half cord consumed." He wrote, "Prior years, equivalent cold, 1 cord consumed." He did not know precisely what the prior years had been because he had not previously tracked wood consumption with this attention. But he knew from watching his father's pile and his father's fire for 22 years what a cold snap cost, and what the previous year's similar cold snap had cost. And the half cord against the cord was a ratio he was confident in. Half cord to produce the same warmth that a cord of wet pile wood produced. The dry wood burning hotter, needing less fire, producing more heat per piece, giving back what the wood had to give without sending half of it up the chimney as steam. He called his sister to read the account. She came and read it and said, "Half." He said, "Close to half." She said, "That is what you said in September." He said, "I said we would know in March. It appears we know in December." She said, "And March will tell us whether the whole winter holds." He said, "Yes." March told them. The March account read, 1 cord and 3/4 consumed October through February, full winter including the harshest cold snap in 14 years. Prior years in Edmund's estimate and his father's recollection, between 3 and 4 cord through an average winter, burning wet pile wood that froze in cold snaps and hissed and steamed and gave back only a portion of what went into the fire. 1 cord and 3/4 against 3 to 4 cord. Edmund read the March account and closed the parchment leaves and went outside to the shed. He had 1 cord and 1/4 remaining. 1 cord and 1/4 of dry ash and birch standing on their poles in the south-facing hillside shed, end grain up, air moving through them from the south opening. The wood had been in the shed since October, and it was drier in March than it had been in October because 6 months of the south wind had continued to pull the remaining moisture out of it. It would be drier still in September when he stacked the new cutting. He pressed his hand to the back wall of the shed. The earth was still at its winter temperature, 48, 49 degrees, the temperature the hillside kept through the hardest Yorkshire winter without being asked or assisted. In 3 months it would be up to 55 as the spring warmth worked its way down through the limestone. In 6 months it would be 60. It would never vary by more than 15 degrees across the full year, the earth's own steadiness, the thing that had been there before any of them arrived. Gilbert Otter came to the March account. He came on the Saturday of the last week of March, when the thaw had released the ground and the mud was deep, and the village had the spring quality of a community that had come through a hard thing and was assessing the damage. He came to see what Edmund had and what the accounts showed, which was the same thing he had been watching since December. He sat at the table in the Hale cottage and read the March account in the household parchment, and then he read the prior year's estimates that Edmund had compiled from memory and his father's memory, and then he sat with his hands on the table and looked at the account. He said, 1 cord and 3/4. Edmund said, "Yes." He said, "Prior years, 3 to 4. Edmund said, "Approximately." He said, "The difference is the shed." Edmund said, "The difference is the dry wood burning twice as efficiently. The shed is what makes the wood dry." Gilbert sat with this for a while. He said, 5 sheds built last spring. They will all show similar accounts. Edmund said, "Broadly similar. The angle of the hillside and the depth of the cutting will affect the temperature the shed holds in January. A better hillside will hold higher than a poor one. But all of them will be above the pile wood by a substantial margin." Gilbert said, "And Thornwick's total wood consumption this winter?" Edmund said, "I cannot calculate that. You have the accounts." Gilbert said, "I have the accounts." He paused. He said, "I think the total is significantly lower than the 3 prior winters. Significantly." He looked at the household account. "I think we used less wood in the hardest winter in 14 years than we used in any of the 3 easier winters before it." Edmund said nothing. Gilbert said, "Because of the 5 sheds and your shed." Edmund said, 6 sheds. Gilbert said, "Yes, 6 sheds." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "More sheds next spring." Edmund said, "I will help anyone who needs help building." He paused. "The main difficulty is finding the right hillside on each holding. Some holdings do not have a south-facing slope that is suitable." Gilbert said, "The common boundary." Edmund said, "Yes, you mentioned it in December." Gilbert said, "I mentioned it, and then I went to look at it through the winter while I was thinking about what I had said." He paused. "There are 4 good sites on the common boundary east ridge that could support sheds of this type. Good south faces, adequate height, the limestone seam running close." Edmund said, "I thought there were 3. Gilbert looked at him. He said, "You looked." Edmund said, "In November. I wanted to know what was available if the matter came to discussion." Gilbert said, "The matter comes to discussion at the Manor Court in April." He paused. "I will bring the proposal for the 4 common boundary sites. The terms will be 5 years holding at no rent in exchange for the labor of building and maintaining the shed. At the end of 5 years, the site and the shed revert to the Lord's domain, and the tenant must rebuild on their own land or find other arrangement." Edmund said, "That is 5 years of benefit and nothing at the end of it." Gilbert said, "Yes." He looked at Edmund. "Do you want me to make a different proposal?" Edmund thought about it. He said, "The 4 families who take the common sites will have 5 winters of dry wood. They will know the method, and they will have their own labor and their own tools at the end of 5 years. Most of them will find a way to build on their own land." Gilbert said, "Yes, that is what I thought." He brought the proposal to the manor court in April. The Lord Steward, who came from Ravensworth Manor to attend the court, examined the proposal with the attention of a man who was calculating what the Lord stood to gain and lose, and arrived, through that calculation, at the same place Gilbert had arrived. 5 sites of low agricultural value becoming improved sites with a useful structure, returning to the domain at the end of 5 years. The Lord lost nothing and gained improved land. The proposal was approved. 4 families built on the common boundary sites in the summer of 1249. 3 more built on their own holdings. A total of 13 sheds were standing in Thornwick by the autumn of 1249, the winter that followed the hardest winter in 14 years. The winter of 1249 to 1250 was not as hard as the one before it. The total wood consumption in Thornwick in that second winter was 40% lower than the average of the 3 winters before Edmund Hale built the first shed. The Manor Court account of 1250 notes, in the section on fuel rents and common rights, that the new wood storage method had reduced the cutting pressure on the common woodland to a degree sufficient to permit the first woodland regeneration management program in the Thornwick records. The Reeves note is short and practical. Less wood burned means less wood cut means the woodland recovers. The connection between the dry shed and the woodland's health was not a thing Edmund had calculated when he was watching the woodpile rot in August of 1248. It was a consequence he had not foreseen that arrived because the thing he had built worked better than the thing it replaced. If this story changed how you think about what careful observation and clear reasoning can do against the weight of how things have always been done, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. And tell me this: have you ever looked at something that everyone accepted as inevitable, looked at it long enough and carefully enough, and found that it was not inevitable at all, that there was another way that was simply waiting to be seen? Because Edmund Hale looked at a wet wood pile in Yorkshire in 1248, and pressed his hand into the soil below it and asked why the wood could not be kept the way the deep earth kept itself, and the answer had been available since before the first timber was cut in England. He just had to stand still long enough to find it. The shed itself stood for 60 years, until the hillside behind it shifted in the floods of 1308 and the back wall fell. By then there were 23 sheds on the Hale pattern in the Thornwick Common and its surrounding holdings, and the method had traveled north through Yorkshire to 2 other manor villages by way of tenants who had seen the Thornwick sheds and asked questions. Edmund's grandson rebuilt the shed in 1310. He built it 2 feet deeper into the hillside and 3 feet wider, having a larger family to keep warm and a larger holding to supply. He built the floor at 20 inches rather than 18, having found that the deeper air gap below the wood moved air more effectively. He extended the overhang to 3 feet because he had observed that the rain in bad years drove harder than his grandfather's design had anticipated. He pressed his hand to the back wall of the new shed before he stacked the first cord. The earth was 48 degrees in October of 1310. It had been 48 degrees in October of every year since Edmund Hale had pressed his own hand to the same hillside 62 years before. It would be 48 degrees in October for as long as the hillside stood. That was what the earth provided, to anyone who thought to put a roof over it, and a floor above it, and let the air move through what they stored inside. Walter Reedman's family was still in Thornwick in 1310. They had been building their firewood shed on the hill-backed model since 1249 and had not missed a year. The account Walter's grandson kept showed 1.5 cords burned, 1309 to 1310 winter, the 3rd winter of a pattern he had inherited the same way he had inherited the holding, as the given condition of how things were done and had been done since before he was old enough to ask why. He did not know the story of October 1248 and the first shed and the laughter. He knew that you stored wood in a hill-backed shed on a south slope with a steep roof and a deep overhang and a raised floor, and you burned half what your neighbors burned and came out of winter with wood remaining. He knew this the way he knew which field was his and which was the common's. It was simply true, and it had been true for as long as anyone he knew could remember. The man who had made it true had pressed his hand into the soil in August and listened to what the earth was saying. The earth had always been saying the same thing. Not everyone stopped to listen.